This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Morning, Connell. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning, Stu.
We've just had a fairly significant conversation before we even turned on the microphones.
As usual.
There wasn't any blood, thankfully, a few bruises, but otherwise we're doing okay.
It was a pretty civil conversation, I thought.
Well, you were, slamming doors you were talking about there, Connell. Listeners, great to have you with us as we continue our Thrive Perspective series, looking at the Christian worldview. And Matt and Connell, we're going to pick up a bit of the conversation from where we left off in our last episode, where we were talking a bit about the limitations of language and how we can use language, and how language can sometimes be difficult to use to explain things that are in an open system as opposed to a closed system, which language is. And it got us to this point at the end of the conversation. And in fact, again, we had a convo after the podcast about where that leaves us in relation to apologetics when we're trying to have conversations with those who have potentially either no interest in faith at one extreme, and really maybe an opportunity opens up to have a conversation with them, or other people at the other end of the spectrum who are actually legitimately and genuinely searching. How we have those conversations within a sense without falling back into the trap of trying to provide logic and reason for what we believe, when sometimes these things, as my favorite word from last week, are ineffable. We can't really explain them. There is mystery, and where that leaves us in those conversations with other people who are used to a world that requires this sort of materialistic or provable evidence of anything being real.
Yeah. So first of all, talking about faith is one of the most important things. It is essentially what in the Bible, when it talks about praise the Lord and all the earth, it's talking about, rave about God, talk about God with everyone and talk about how good God is. That is also evangelism. Evangelism is a very important part of the New Testament mandate to go and make disciples of all the nations. It involves talking about something. We are the messengers of the good news, but we're more than messengers. We're witnesses to the good news. We're first-hand witnesses. And we've talked in previous episodes about the fact that this isn't just an objective fact for us. We have a first-hand connection with this truth. And so we're witnesses of that. And we are to be witnesses, very open witnesses. We're to be as a light. Don't put a cover over your light, shine as a light. And that looks like having conversations with people, and even sparking conversations. It might be asking them about what they think about things. And we're in our society today, we're pretty shallow in a sense. A lot of conversations rarely go to much depth, but it's good to just to try to break through that veneer as well, sensitively, of course. Otherwise, it'll be awkward. But that's the key thing, is to not just shut down. We do need to have these conversations, and so as soon as we begin to have a conversation about faith, we are using reason. As soon as you use language, you're using reason. It talks about, in the book of Acts, for example, it'll say, it says that Paul reasoned with the Jews, or that he reasoned with people, through these things. But the thing is, when you reason, you always reason from something. Reason always has a departure point. There's always a premise upon which it reasons from. Right. No one reasons from no premise. Yeah. And whatever the premise you reason from, that premise itself cannot be established by reason. This is the important thing. This is where the closed system can't prove it itself. So, the idea that there's nothing outside of what can be sort of logically or, empirically treated, well, the problem is that worldview cannot itself really be rationally justified, At the end of the day, we have to make a choice about what our premise is, what our worldview, what our story is. And obviously, people come up with a premise that tends to work best for them. Like, to give you an example, I was having a conversation with someone, and I asked them, what do you think about I forget the question about faith stuff, or, do you have any church background or something? I put the question to them. As I like to do, I always like to ask people that question, and I'm interested in their response. And, this person, very intelligent person, obviously fairly well read, said, well, I think that religion is a sort of byproduct of an evolutionary process, and that human beings came up with religion to explain things that they couldn't explain. And then, so he gave me the whole origin of religion kind of account. Now, the interesting thing about that is that atheism isn't the conclusion of that. It's the premise of that. So, so atheism, he was trying to explain to me why he's an atheist, but
it starts with the fact there isn't a God, so there isn't a God. That's the fact, and we're inventing something to help us navigate questions we can't answer, as opposed to asking the question, "Is there a God?"
That's right. So atheism or a closed world system was his premise, really, and that itself, again, is just something that we choose, and
a lot of people aren't even aware of the fact that they do choose that.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's a lot of people aren't even used to thinking. There's a lot of things that seem intuitively logical or reasonable or rational to us.
Yeah.
But we've never actually had anyone poke at them before and really make us think about whether they are actually even reasonable positions to hold.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess what we do is that we start with certain premises. We start with the premise that there is a God who has revealed himself to us. That is the premise upon which we have all of our conversations about God. Not only that there is a God, but there is a God who has revealed himself to us. And, without that premise, you're just, you're pretty arbitrary, really. And I guess when we talk about faith, this comes back to the witnesses thing. We are believers because God has revealed himself to us. And I say us in the bigger sense of all humankind, God has revealed, but also to us personally by his Holy Spirit. Yeah. Now, again, you can't build a logical bridge to someone with that. Like if I wanted to prove, a scientific theory to you about the way that, certain particles operate or, whatever, then I can, that's a matter of empirical fact, and I can just demonstrate that and show you, and it's all pretty cut and dry, relatively speaking. But you can't really do that with God. And one of the dangers is because of what we believe about God is not just the sort of the invisible man in the sky idea, which is that kind of deist or almost what has been called monotheistic polytheism or something like like in ancient polytheism, you had all these gods like Zeus and Apollo and these various gods. And in a sense, sometimes it sounds like the way that Christians talk about God is that they've reduced it just to one of those, so there's not all the others, but it's still like Zeus, sitting up on his mountain in the sky. Yeah. And that's actually not what we think God is. And that's a view of God that often gets caricatured in fact, a lot of the atheism that came out in the 2000s that was referred to then as the new atheism was largely based on that idea, and so people would say things like, well, you might as well posit the existence like of a flying purple people eater, and then, but we're not positing the existence of some discrete being here. We're positing the existence of the one from whom our being is derived, our being and consciousness, and who is ever present in all things, and yet also transcendent, and so forth. So the problem is, one of the problems with conversations this is what we've got to watch out when we have conversations, particularly when it gets into a bit of a debate, a rational debate over the existence of God. And this is where we get to apologetics. One of the cautions is that we don't lead people into this relationship with the question of God, where that becomes an object that they're standing outside of. This is really the big problem with the kind of skepticism that is really the most common in our context, is that it's a scientific kind of skepticism. Well, just give me the proof, and I'll believe it. And Hitchens famously said, you need, for an extraordinary claim, you need extraordinary evidence.
For extraordinary claims, you need extraordinary.
That's right. That's the quote.
I think it was Hitchens.
Yeah. So let's just to analyze that for a moment. The problem with that is he's talking very much in terms of quantity, because it's extraordinary yes, it is an extraordinary claim. And by extraordinary, I would say we're not making a claim about the existence of a discrete empirical object. So therefore, you just need an extra abundant measure of empirical evidence to prove that, because it's an extraordinary empirical, discrete empirical object. No, it's actually of a completely different nature. Even so, it requires a different nature of evidence, and this is the problem with that. People think, well, so therefore I can demand extraordinary evidence from you, meaning that you have to come up with an extraordinarily good argument. Now, the problem with that is that has you standing outside of the question of God, as though you're God, essentially trying to shape or referring to something that is, something that you're trying to grasp and sort of hand over to someone nicely prepackaged and tied up in a nice logical ribbon. But we can't do that because we're inside. We are. We're inside this. We can't stand on the outside. And the danger is that when we have these logical arguments, this is the danger of some forms of apologetics, is that you've got people saying, well, if God is real, put the evidence before me, so that I can see and sort of circumscribe it intellectually and say, yes, I can see that. And, so therefore I can grasp that this is, a logical idea. Now, by trying to prove that it is all very logical, we stand in danger of actually approving where they're standing, that existential position, right. Almost pretending to stand the conceit of standing outside of reality and looking in on the question of God. We've got to be careful that we're not encouraging that,
it's a great
that
point.
detached
it's like a bit of a trap
approach.
And this is the problem. Like if you're in your workplace, you got to be a light. You can't hide who you are and what you believe. And inevitably there's opinions, goes back to our episode a few weeks ago about, we've all got opinions and so on, and we haven't really qualified to hold those opinions. So you're dealing with people with opinions, then you've people who are well read in atheism, and they've read the books and they're compelled by the arguments that are presented, and they're looking for people to have that argument with. And so they actually sort of grab hold of the discussion with the aim of driving you down this path of producing the evidence, because they know that you can't produce the evidence within their framework that they're going to take you down. So they kind of steer you down this road, and it's a trap. You're operating from their worldview.
And from the premise.
From their premise. That's right.
That premise. And I know myself from sort of going down the road of really getting into apologetics and trying to get those rational arguments for myself as I've been questioning faith, is it's just one thing after another, after another, after another. You think that you can get answers to all these questions yourself. You're just always one book away from understanding, how to explain this and how to explain that. And it just goes on and on and on. And so any result of those conversations is never really going to go anywhere if that's the if that's the premise that you're going to have it from. So if you're in your workplace or whatever, and you're going to invite discussions and conversations around that, it's difficult because you've got to firstly be on guard that you don't fall into that trap. But then what do you do? Yeah. Because then you end up in a philosophical discussions and you have to sort of almost be smarter than the person you're trying to argue with. Not that you should not, it's not really how it should work, but that's how you feel, and you can easily get intimidated by somebody who's able to think you on the spot. You might have great answers for it, 15 minutes after the conversation's ended, but on the spot, so it's a hard thing to actually to get right.
Just a couple of things on that, if I can, because you're spot on, and I think it is a real challenge. I think if I can just say up front, probably one of the most important things before we even enter into a conversation with anyone about these things is to make sure that our life actually matches what we're saying. That's the first and greatest witness. No one's going to believe you if you're saying one thing, but the way they look at you, live your life is completely different. So that whole integrity of living, in a way that is honoring of Christ and his price paid. So I think that's an important thing, because I've had conversations with people who have said, I knew there was something different about you. I'm not saying I was a wonderful person, but that shone first, which opened the opportunity for the conversation from a perspective where they're going, you clearly believe it. It's not just an argument you're wanting to have here. So I think
which is not just a moralistic thing.
No,
too.
it's not.
It's that they really feel loved by you.
Yes.
Because the big difference that God makes is that we look at people differently. We see people differently. They're absolutely sacred, and and we treat people as absolutely sacred, and and that's what love is. We love them, and that's already a powerful a powerful witness.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
And the second thing is, I think a lot of, particularly perhaps the people who have done a lot of reading on the atheism, and this is a generalization, so take this or leave this, but I think there's a vast number of those people who actually don't want it to be true.
Yeah.
So it's not like they're trying to find the truth. They're actually just trying to prove their perspective. Most people don't enter those conversations, particularly those stronger atheists who have, as you said, read all the books, and they're actually not looking for the truth. They just want to prove their point. So, and they don't want God to be true, because that then throws everything for them. There's accountability. There's a whole heap of stuff
well, at a deep level, that's true, because essentially, if all people are in sin as the and by that it doesn't mean that, actually, even that in a moralistic sense they're necessarily worse than us.
No, totally.
In fact, I know lots of non-Christian people, I think, in a sort of moral sort of sense, kind of far better people than me in a sense. But the idea of being in sin is a relational thing. It's I guess there is this deep protectiveness that we have of our autonomy, and people hold on to that with great vehemence and very protective of that. I know that because I do, right? Because that's something that through my Christian walk and Christian growth, I've had to let go of my autonomy, and that is essentially what faith is. It's completely surrendering yourself over and putting your life in God's hands. And we're not want to do that because we're addicted to autonomy. And so there's this deep motivation that people have for resisting this. And yet I think reality works against that. So the problem in our culture is that a lot of people just live in such a way that they don't give themselves the space. There's so much noise and busyness. And also we're a pretty comfortable society. A lot of people just don't care. That's one of the problems. But I think there are moments in which they do care. Yeah. I think deep down they do care.
Yeah. The last thing I want to say to wrap up that about the way we live is the way we therefore then have those conversations, regardless of how they are to us. We need to reflect, as you said before, that we love these people, so they might be slamming the doors and thumping the desk, and it might be that we go up and go, hey, look, I didn't want to, my goal was not to upset you. I just wanted to have a genuine conversation, to not let that have us respond in the same way, in a sense, and become, pig-headed about it. It's like, that's where we can be a point of difference. And that's, I think, what starts to soften people to go, well, actually, tell me a bit more about that,
It works both ways too, though, because I think as Christians too, we want to be right.
Yes.
I think it was one of those new atheists said, essentially, as a Christian, you are an atheist to every other religion out there. The only real difference between me as a Christian and them as an atheist is they don't believe in sort of one more religion than me. I believe in mine, but disregard all of the others, and so.
Yeah, I think Hitchens said, I just believe in one less God.
Yeah, that's right. So, and so I will also strongly defend what I believe. And I think there's an element of that, a big element of that too, and where people are coming from as well. They want to be right. I do believe they really do believe there is no God, and believing there is a God is just completely intellectually. You have to be stupid to believe there's a God. I mean, all the evidence points to the fact that there isn't a God. You have to, and
they would say
you're just not understanding why. You've been brought up this way, or you haven't read enough, or there's some things you don't understand, and this is how they look at it with you. So I don't think they're necessarily going, I actually believe in God, but I want to suppress it, and then that might be going on somewhere. But I think there is a genuine. I mean, I had a discussion with a hard atheist, and they said, I actually do wish it was true, what you believe.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It would make things just so much better, but I just cannot believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that position again comes from that closed world system that I just can't, so that response, I mean, it's interesting that Ian McGilchrist, who is this philosopher / neurologist and has done all of this work on the brain and the way that the different sides sort of correcting old theories of left and right brain and talking about how left and right brain are two different processing systems. And he talks about the left brain as a closed processing system and the right brain being this open system. And, he talks about a lot of approaches to reality are, and particularly in our culture, it's very left brain oriented. We like a closed system. And I think what he shows is that at different points, culture can nurture certain capacities even within the human brain. And his point is that in our culture, we're a very left brain culture. We work in a closed, we prefer a closed system. And he talks about situations like that as almost like a bit of a left brain tantrum. Now, the interesting thing is with that hardcore close, what Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls a closed world system, which was characteristic of the new atheism. So that reaction of what, of it, it's just ridiculous. I can't possibly believe it's true. Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, has a chapter titled, why Christianity almost certainly isn't true. And he basically does a bit of a God of the gaps thing. We've closed the gap, so now we can explain anything. We don't need God. Now, it's so faulty as an argument because, again, it's based on a deistic conception of God who builds a big machine, but now that we can explain the big machine, we don't, there's no gaps for God that, and we can explain that how the machine made itself. And all of that is based on a really faulty idea of God. That's one of the problems with that. But it's also the closed nature of it because it cannot prove its own premise. That in a sense it's actually based on a positivistic philosophy that died out like in the 60s and 70s because it was acknowledged that this fact-based worldview, that there's nothing except for tangible facts. There's no reality outside of material reality that can't prove its own premise. It's that method cannot, the method can't prove itself. And so already, and I mentioned this before, the atheistic philosopher John Gray says in his book, he's got a book called 7 Types of Atheism, and he covers, the different types. And he more or less says that that new atheism is like an embarrassment to atheism because it's just so that closed world system, you just can't really acknowledge that. And his form of atheism and the kind of atheism that is probably most acceptable, that is, the philosopher Thomas Nagel, for example, holds to. They've opened up their worldview and they incorporate a lot of spiritual elements. They say that mind is the basic element of reality, not matter. Now they don't try to even explain that. They just say this goes outside of what we can explain. Thomas Nagel in his book Mind and Cosmos, he just honestly says, look, one explanation for this is this could be God. He said, I can't put any arguments really against that. He said, I just have to be honest and say I don't like that idea. And I think, and this is probably one of the world's leading philosophers, and I think it's a much more cautious approach, whereas the what was known, that new atheism, which is also known as scientific atheism, is very philosophically naive. And it certainly is what, McGilchrist, who is also that type of, McGilchrist isn't an atheist, but he has he believes in something more like probably Brahman, like the Hindu notion of God. So that kind of, I just can't. There are problems with that. It's another way of saying I just won't actually, because there's a holding on to this closed world system, which is what McGilchrist calls a kind of left brain tantrum. If I can't grasp it, or if it doesn't make sense to me, then I'm not going to accept it. And that's not can't, that's won't, because again, it's our desire to have this subject-object relationship with reality, where reality is like this object that I can intellectually circumscribe and grasp, when I don't think the best thinkers in the world have called that one out.
So the thing
a long time ago.
then, in having these conversations with people, you could go into it with the objective to try to answer all their questions and allow them to ask the questions, and you just keep trying to provide answers.
Yeah.
But I think a better way of tackling that, which comes back to what you're just saying there, I think they won't let go of it, but I think they need to see the problem for themselves. The fact that it's not so much a question of evidence, but it's the fact that they won't let go of their idea or their worldview. Because in a lot of ways, especially if they've absorbed a lot of information from that new atheist style of thinking, they're heavily invested in this naturalistic, scientific, evidence-based
because that's the culture
worldview.
that we talk about cultural conditioning. That's
they've
what we've been
totally conditioned into that. Yeah, they really find those arguments really, and they are quite convincing. So I think one of the first things that I do, I don't know, I just end up with all these atheists that I tend to attract for some reason. A lot of them are angry and hostile and just assume that I'm missing some key piece of information. And whilst they recognize that I'm not completely dumb, they are confused as to how I've possibly accepted such irrational thinking. But what my aim isn't to answer their questions. It's really to try to rock their worldview
to question their answers
and to get back to those premises. To show them that they actually are buying into premises that they've never actually challenged. And they need to really think about why they hold those premises.
That's great.
And so whoever you're talking to, there's some level of having to answer some questions, but it's not allowing them to control the conversation, but more about trying to understand their worldview and then you talking to them in a way to ask them questions back that makes them start to actually critically think their worldview. Because once they start to move their worldview, now you're starting to move them in a direction where you can have healthy conversations. As an example, for talking to an atheist, they would demand all this extraordinary evidence. The other thing that you get in science is you can work with, there might be like 3 different theories on the table. None of them can be proven, but one of them fits reality better. You may not necessarily have the hard evidence that you need, but which worldview actually fits with explaining the reality of the world and how I engage with the world better. And then when you actually show them their naturalistic atheist worldview actually works counter to reality. When you're talking about love and relationships and value of human life and morality and things like that, it's an uphill battle for them to reconcile that with how they feel about their family when they go home at night. The love that they feel for their family and their children.
Which is an experience of transcendence, essentially.
Yeah.
It's the experience of a transcendent value. I mean, you're in the presence of something sacred, and the love that they feel is outside of dimensions that they can, to say, it's just chemical reactions in the brain.
But really, is that how you view when you're?
I'm just evolution as what do they say about there's an evolutionary explanation for love. I can't remember what it is, but it's all about offspring and your genes and everything. And it's come on,
and you're happy. You're happy with that explanation because you know that it's more than that. You know it is. You know human life has a intrinsic value that is far more than just the atoms that make their. So I find they don't accept that, not at least on the surface, but somewhere along the line you're kind of picking holes. You're making them think about it in a way that they haven't thought of it before. And so, I've had arguments. Well, I've tried not to have arguments, discussions that, once I lay those kinds of things down, I've had them before get really angry and start shouting and walk out and slam the doors and then come back in and apologize. And you go through this, these
cycle.
Little tantrums really. And it's really hard to get through. But with those same people, I've also had conversations where you've actually been able to get beneath that a bit. We're talking about human value, for example. What makes me have any value or worth? And their question was, well, how does God fix that problem? And straight away, that's a good conversation to have because they're not taking control of the situation. You're helping them see, well, think about value and worth and what does it look like from their perspective, well, okay, well then how does God cause anything then to have value?
Yeah.
So now you're starting to talk about who God is. And I think that opens up a whole, you're no longer talking about evidence. You're revealing to them something about God that they've never thought about before. I think that's a much more healthy road to go down.
I always try to lead away from just those debates about evidence. And I mean, and often I'll ask, I'll say something like, I put a hypothetical. If God is real, how would you know? And they might say, well, he could, turn up and think, but that wouldn't be good because God is infinite and eternal and and he's intangible and he's not a discrete. So if a discrete thing, appears in the corner of the room, that's infinitely less than what God is. And so, you're experiencing an object and God is not an object. So,
Well, what about if Jesus, you looked up and you saw him riding on the cloud? Surely that would go, well, I would probably think that's probably the government testing some new technology out, or you could make it, whatever it could be. Well, maybe it's just aliens, there is no physical evidence that you could.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it is absolutely worth recognizing that everyone, when we have these conversations, everyone argues from a premise. But just going back to some of the basics, I mean, what is language for? And we've talked about this, we've talked about this before. Like languages have been given to us by God for a relational purpose. It's a relational thing. We can't use our language to pull apart and dissect every aspect of reality. It's become this almost like this power tool for us. It's a way that we construct our own reality, whereas actually language is a relational thing. And I think we've just got to be careful that we use it that way when we're having conversations, that we keep it relational. Yeah. It's not I'm smarter than you. And honestly, I
not
think
as a weapon.
Yeah.
Totally.
And some people listening might think, oh man, I don't think I can have these sort of conversations. Now, I do think we need to be equipped to have some kind of conversation. It's no use just saying, oh yeah, I don't know. I mean, recognizing the mystery and the limitations of language and what we can do with language, that's not an excuse for not knowing and understanding what you believe. We need to give it, as the New Testament says, we need to give an answer for the hope that within. Always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that is in you. And
some of that, Matt, could be just if you find it difficult to get into the aspects of the conversation, it can be just a personal testimony, knowing how to share your personal testimony. Yeah. Look, I don't know how to explain that, but this is what happened to me. Yeah. Is sometimes a great place to start.
Yeah. And we don't even necessarily need to talk about an event or because people can say, well, that could just be some psychological sort of thing. You could have just been, I mean, we're actually living in a dynamic, ongoing relationship. And I think there's something to share in that, something to share in terms of how we live our life, and talking about how we live our life fairly openly. I find that without necessarily trying to justify that, and often if I have ongoing relationships with people. I mean, if it's people, in your workplace or in your people that you see again and again, it's just it's normalizing that that's part of my life. This is how I live. Yeah. I pray about these things. It's just modeling a life in relationship with God and being open about that with people, not putting it too much on display or trying to artificially just being put genuine. It in every moment. It's actually about not hiding it, as we would talk to each other. I think that's really important. But it's important that we understand enough about our faith to be able to talk about it, and that's where the testimony thing, I think, is important. That it's about being open about the way that we live our lives and our ongoing relationship with God. But certainly there are moments when people question us where I think rather than trying to offer a philosophical justification, I've often said the best apologetic is often good theology. I've done a lot of reading and work in apologetics. I've taught apologetics as a subject at Bible college. And so therefore I've read a lot of, stuff that's coming from a skeptical point of view. A lot of the answers to the arguments coming from skeptics and non-believers are actually straightforward biblical answers. Like, for example, I said when I read Dawkins' The God Delusion, I'm thinking, well, that's not the biblical God. That's not the God that he's arguing against is not the God that I believe in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, even arguments about, the problem of evil argument is quite a common one. How can an all-powerful, all-knowing, loving God exist in a world with, gross evil and suffering? And there's a biblical answer for that question. The biblical narrative answers that question. I think it's the best answer to that question.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of understanding the biblical story, understanding enough of what you believe to be able to say, oh, no, that's not actually what I believe. I don't believe that God is just,
Out
like
there.
the one less. Oh, well, I just believe, there are all these gods and then I just believe. No, but see, that's not. That we don't believe in gods. We believe in one all-pervasive, God, not a discrete being up in the sky somewhere. So I think just knowing what you believe is a really big step forward in having these conversations.
Yeah. So that's understanding the theology and the doctrine that you believe in and being able to articulate it back in a way that people who are completely unfamiliar with it hear it. And it actually, because a lot of people are against Christianity because of a perception. They've got a view of what we actually believe that's not true, that God is a narcissistic, genocidal, again, Hitchens wrote that book, God is not great. And it's, or Stephen Fry is another one who is often on his soapbox, really making a strong case that if the Christian God exists, he's a very, very unpleasant being that you really want nothing to do with. So people have built up a view of God that isn't necessarily healthy either. And if you go to we've talked about atheists, but you go to people on the other end of the spectrum who are very spiritually open, but have gone down a different path, and so they've a much more satisfying to the human mind as to what suits them. God just loves everyone. I can't believe in a God who'd want to have hell and punish us and say that certain people are bad and some are good, and even put us into a world where we're exposed to evil and allows children. And I don't believe in that kind of God, so I want to believe in this kind of God, and they end up down other paths. Could be just their own version of some sort of spirituality, which I've had discussions with people before, and that don't ascribe to any particular religion, but they would say, well, look, I believe there's something, I just don't know what it is, and so on. Or you get others who have gone down a particular other road, down another religion. And how you talk to those people is very different to someone who's an atheist.
But the principle's the same, because it's understanding enough. If you understand your faith enough, I think you can have those sort of conversations, because you understand enough about God and the plan of God and how it unfolded to be able to at least talk through some of those things. And you also understand that what God wants the most is a relationship with us. And so, the belief in just some God out there somewhere, or, I have this belief and it makes me happy. Well, that's not really the point. The point is, are we in a right relationship with God? That's the key question, really, from a biblical point of view. And so I think when we have conversations like that, even, what you described about, God being the monster that, does all these terrible things. I mean, it doesn't take much of I think even a basic understanding of the trajectory, the story of Scripture and the culmination of the self-revelation of God in Jesus Christ to debunk that idea. It just takes a decent biblical understanding to be able to say, oh, no, actually, that's not, yes, I understand there are these things there, and there's such a thing as evil, and God hates evil, but that's because God is good. But we see God's goodness most culminatively in Jesus Christ. And if you want to know what God is like, hey, how about you read the Gospels? And
it's the same principle I said before, like it's trying to change their worldview, because with an atheist, you're trying to shake their worldview. And I think with someone who's already committed to going down some other kind of spiritual path, is changing their worldview, because it's leading them to be open to consider the theology behind Christianity. So it's like they believe that it's all about love and loving each other and so on. But they also live in a world that's pretty broken, and we all cry out for something better, and we know that it's broken. And you can have those kind of conversations, but there's things that are going on. How do you explain them? Like, is there a sense? Where does justice fit into this, and so on? That their worldview, it might sit with them well in their mind, but they haven't really thought about how does it line up with reality in the world that we actually live in. And then that naturally, I think all of those worldviews, reality actually plugs back into the explanation that's in the biblical worldview.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter whether you talk about atheists or a new ager, there's some reality that ultimate reality. I think biblical worldview is probably the most powerful worldview to actually explain reality and the doctrine that sits behind it and the answer to that reality. And I think it's being clear on what those connections are and what that doctrine and how to explain it and connect it to people, to their worldviews, to try to lead them out of their worldview into a different.
Yeah, and you don't have to be an expert in that to start talking about faith stuff.
No, that's right.
Again, remember, we keep coming back to this. Even if you've been a Christian for one day, you have a testimony, you have something to share. And there's something powerful about that testimony. Remember, it's real. God is within us. The Holy Spirit uses our witness to open things up in people's hearts. So don't think it's going to rest on the power of your arguments or your superior biblical knowledge. Or it's not resting on that. Actually, your witness, you are carrying something powerful, and that has an effect. That's where I like the idea of a light. It's like there is a light within you. Just be open, talk honestly about it. And I think there's a spiritual intuition that taps into. And as God opens their hearts, that's going to turn lights on within them.
And I think that's where it's really important that all of these conversations, as I think you said, Matt, these conversations all need to be had in the key of love. It's like the minute we become combative and all we're trying to do is prove them wrong, we've actually defeated ourselves in some ways. It's got to be done in the key of love because it actually matters. We actually care about your life here and your life in eternity. Yeah. That's why we're having this conversation, not just to slap you down and tell you you're wrong and I'm right.
When I used to have I would be quite combative with some atheists, and I wanted to have an answer for everything. And then you find yourself starting to make stuff up to try to answer them and so on. Even with your own testimony, making stuff up because maybe it wasn't lining up to the reality that I thought. It's almost like I need to defend God, because my relationship with God isn't actually all that great, and I don't really want to tell this person what it's really like. So I have to present a version,
an ideal
and I would find myself doing that when now I think I would much more able to say, look, I don't know. This is me, my own faith journey and the things that I struggle with. And there's all these questions that I have about God myself. There's a sort of an authenticity in that.
Yeah.
But it also frees me of the responsibility of having to have all of those answers because I don't need to defend God. I don't need to feel like I've got to rush in there and come to his rescue. God can defend himself. I don't need to, in the sense of I don't need to defend God for what he has or hasn't done. It's like if somebody's seen somebody and that they've seen Christians praying for someone and they died, I don't need to defend God. And if they become an atheist as a result of that, that's not my problem. All I can do is tell you what God is to me in the journey. And even with all its warts as well, the bumps along the road, I don't need to dress it up. And I can talk about my struggles. And also there's lots of questions that I don't know and can't answer. And I think that's a very disarming thing. But at the same time, I need to be able to present some kind of intelligent response that shows that I haven't arrived at this just because I was brought up to believe it. That I have actually...
Or I've reasoned through it and that's how I got there.
Yeah. And so I have thought about these things because often having these conversations with atheists, they think that I just haven't thought about it. And so I've actually thought about it a lot more than what they have. If they even just get that message without even answering all of the fact that I have thought about it and this is where I've ended up, I've had them before say to me, you are the most skeptical, rational thinking, you're intelligent. Does my head in that you believe this stuff. That in itself is probably the most strongest challenge of my own testimony is the fact that they recognize I'm a real cynic, real skeptical, test every idea, rationalize everything. And then when it comes to this, I actually believe that there's a God and I have my faith in him. That in itself presents a real conundrum for them to wrestle with.
Yeah.
We had someone post a comment on the ThriveToday.tv Facebook page as a comment saying, I can't understand how seemingly intelligent people still believe this stuff, exactly that point,
And that is our testimony. I mean, and in fact, some of the most intelligent people in the world out there, are, very strong Christians. And, one of the things that I try to, in conversation, I love having faith conversations with people, but I always try to bring it back to that relational core. God is inviting us into a relationship with himself. And that's made possible through Jesus Christ. This is why I believe this, and I have this relationship with God, and it is the core of my life. I don't claim to have got it all right. I'm quick to say I've fallen short, and you may well be a better person than me. I'm not, even if I'm talking, when questions about, sexual ethics and all of these things come up, which is a hot button issue, I just explain, well, for me, this is why I think. I'm not telling you what to do, right? That's to take the combative thing out. I believe that, human beings are sacred, and you can't just do whatever we want with something that is sacred. And so this is why I choose to draw a tight circle around this. And I think by bringing that testimonial angle to it and sharing, personally in the context of a conversation where someone feels loved and valued, where you're interested in them as well, I think it can be a wonderful experience. Of course, people will reject that. That'll happen. It's always happened. I don't think that we should then stop saying, it's like wipe the dust off our feet and sort of, sometimes you just need to let it go. Sometimes there is this, it's probably not going to be fruitful to keep having this discussion. But I think in most cases, we need to be prepared to lift the lid on this aspect of reality.
And it might be over a number of conversations.
Yeah, it might be over a number of conversations.
We sometimes want to get to the end in this first conversation. It's just, as you said earlier, Connell, sowing the seed where they then might come back and ask another question, and you just got to go at the speed of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Not at the speed of trying to get to the finish line.
And we've got to remember, people aren't used to often discussing these things. And so, perhaps we just need to sow in some things, and if we continue the discussion, that's great. I mean, look, often it's been at a wedding where I'm just talking to some random person or some other event, and you're never probably going to see that person again. And because I know that I'm probably never going to see this person again, it's not like I have to jam the 4 spiritual laws in, but I personalize it and share. Whenever I share my testimony, it's relational. I'm pointing to Jesus. And I'm praising God. Of course, going to come back to that, because I'm not going to try and win an argument. They might ask questions, and I will, refer to the biblical story or to Christian beliefs to help. But I will always say, look, why don't you look into this? I would really encourage you, read a gospel. If you haven't read a gospel at one point in your life, I think it's really important to do this. And I'll often point them to the Gospel of Luke, and just so that they can go, there's a challenge there. Here's something to do. Maybe why not go along to church with that friend of yours that or just keep an open mind. It's worth looking into, what can you lose by looking into it? But by not looking into it, you can lose everything. And I think just that little bit of being prepared for a little bit of a challenge, a little bit of a pathway forwards, and always in the key of love.
Listeners, if this episode has inspired some questions you'd like to ask, don't hesitate to jump on our website, thrivetoday.tv. And there's a place there where you can lodge a question. We'd love to see those questions come in. We did a Q&A episode not so long ago, and there were some great questions raised there. So again, thrivetoday.tv, go to our website. We'd love to see some questions you might have around this conversation or any of the conversations we've had through this Worldview series.